When my late husband's brother decided my grief made me an easy target to steal our family home, I didn't scream. I'm Vivian Vance, 60, a night shift medical billing clerk from Ohio, and I'm about to show you what happens when a patient woman rewrites the terms of a family's greed. If you have ever sat at a worn laminate kitchen table at 3 o'clock in the morning, holding a cold cup of store-brand tea, and realizing that the people who share your last name are the very ones trying to tear the roof from over your head, then you know the specific quiet terror that settled into my bones last winter. My husband, Ray, had been gone just 6 months. He was a machinist at the tube mill for 34 years, a man with grease permanently etched into the lines of his knuckles and a heart that was far too large for his tired chest. When the mill shut down its primary furnace, they took his medical insurance with it. By the time the cancer took him, our savings were gone, swallowed whole by the insatiable machinery of modern healthcare. I was left with our small, aluminum-sided ranch home on the edge of Steubenville, a mountain of outstanding bills, and a silence so loud it made my ears ring. To keep the mortgage from slipping through my fingers, I took the only job available to a 60-year-old woman whose primary skill was navigating the labyrinth of insurance codes, the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift at the county hospital's billing department. It was exhausting, soul-crushing work. While the rest of the town slept under heavy quilts, I sat under the buzzing hum of fluorescent lights, entering codes for broken bones, chemotherapy infusions, and emergency room visits. Because I didn't drive at night, my eyes no longer cooperating with the glare of oncoming headlights on wet asphalt, the county transit service provided a rideshare program for essential shift workers. That was how I met Arthur. Arthur was 67, a retired school bus driver with a silver mustache and eyes that had seen every kind of Ohio winter. He drove the small white transit van with a steady, comforting hand. Every single night at 10:15 p.m., his headlights would sweep across my front porch, and every morning at 7:20 a.m., he would pull back into my driveway to drop me off. It didn't take long for us to establish a routine. Arthur was a man of few words, but his silence wasn't cold. It was the quiet of someone who respected the weight of another person's day. I started bringing 2 travel mugs with me every night. Mine was a chipped green plastic tumbler, but his was a blue enamel mug with a tiny chip on the rim, filled with hot chamomile tea and a generous spoonful of wild clover honey. "To keep the Ohio draft out of your joints, Arthur," I'd say, handing it to him over the console. "Much obliged, Vivian," he'd always reply, taking a slow, appreciative sip before putting the van in gear. "How's the ledger looking tonight?" "A lot of numbers, Arthur. Just a lot of numbers." We were 2 older people pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, trying to survive in a town that felt like it was slowly being erased by time and economic decay. But while I was spending my nights staring at computer screens to save my home, my next-door neighbor, who also happened to be my brother-in-law, Silas, was spending his days trying to take it. Silas had always looked down on Ray and me. He had married Clara, a woman whose family owned 3 car dealerships down in Wheeling, and he carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a man who had married into money rather than earning it. Silas and Clara lived in a sprawling modern brick home on the hill directly overlooking my modest property. Ever since Ray's funeral, Silas had been dropping by under the guise of checking on the widow, but his visits always ended the same way. He would stand in my kitchen, his polished leather boots looking entirely out of place on my worn linoleum, and point out the window toward the wooded creek at the back of my property. "You know, Vivian," Silas would say, his voice dripping with a greasy sort of sympathy, "a woman alone shouldn't have to worry about property taxes on 3 acres of unused land. The state is planning a commercial access road right through that lower ridge. If you sell the back acreage to my development firm now, I can get you a decent price before the county just eminent domains it for pennies. It's what Ray would have wanted. He wouldn't want you working yourself to the bone at that hospital." Every time he said Ray's name, my stomach turned. Ray had loved that land. He used to sit on the back porch with his binoculars, watching the deer come down to the creek at dusk. "I'm keeping the land, Silas," I told him, keeping my voice level, though my hands trembled beneath the dish towel I was holding. "Ray built this house. We planted those white pines ourselves. I can manage." Silas's face would stiffen, the faux warmth vanishing from his eyes to reveal something cold and calculating. "You're stubborn, Vivian. just like him. But stubbornness doesn't pay the property taxes when the county reassesses next month. Don't say I didn't try to help you when the bank comes knocking. But it wasn't just his verbal pressure that started to wear on me. It was the unsettling feeling that followed. About a month into my night shift routine, things in my house began to feel slightly off. I am a meticulous woman. When you spend 30 years organizing medical files and tax documents, you develop a sense of order. One morning, I came home to find my small cedar lockbox, the one where I kept our marriage certificate, the house deed, and Ray's old union papers, sitting on the closet shelf at a slightly different angle than I always left it. Another morning, I noticed the smell of cold pipe tobacco in my living room. I don't smoke. Ray didn't smoke. But Silas was never without his cherry blend pipe. I tried to tell myself I was losing my mind from sleep deprivation. When you only sleep in 4-hour increments during the day, your brain plays tricks on you. My niece, Nicole, Ray's sister's daughter, a sweet girl who worked as a receptionist at a local dental clinic and often stopped by to help me weed my small tomato patch, cried when I told her about my suspicions. "Aunt Viv," Nicole said, her eyes welling up as she squeezed my hands across the kitchen table. "Silas is a snake. Everyone in the family knows how he squeezed Grandma out of her inheritance. But would he really break into your house? That's a crime. Maybe you just forgot to lock the back door because you're so tired." "Maybe," I whispered, wanting so desperately to believe her. "But I've locked that deadbolt every night since 1984, Nicole. It's muscle memory." The anxiety began to eat at me. Every night when Arthur picked me up, I would look back at my dark house, feeling a heavy weight in my chest. I started checking the window locks 3 times before leaving. I even placed a small, almost invisible piece of black thread across the jamb of the back door, a trick I'd read about in a mystery novel years ago. 2 days later, when I got home in the morning, the thread was lying on the kitchen floor. Someone had been inside my home while I was entering medical codes at the hospital. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I had no proof. The locks weren't broken. There were no muddy footprints. Just the lingering, ghostly scent of cherry tobacco and the terrifying realization that my sanctuary was no longer safe. Then came that freezing Thursday in mid-November. The night shift had been brutal. The hospital database had crashed at midnight, leaving us to process emergency admissions by hand. By the time 7 a.m. rolled around, my eyes were burning, and my lower back felt like it was locked in a vice. When I walked out of the hospital lobby, the Ohio air was thick with a damp, gray fog that rolled off the river, turning the barren trees into skeletal silhouettes. Arthur's white van was idling at the curb, its exhaust plume rising thick and white in the freezing air. I climbed into the passenger seat, immediately letting out a long breath as the blast of the heater hit my frozen face. I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out the blue enamel mug, handing it to him. It was hot, filled to the brim with chamomile tea. "Morning, Arthur," I said, my voice hoarse. "It's a cold one out there today." Arthur didn't reply immediately. He took the mug, but instead of taking his usual slow sip, he set it carefully in the cup holder. His hands, usually so steady on the steering wheel, were gripping the leather cover so tightly his knuckles were white. He didn't look at me. He just put the van in drive and pulled out of the hospital parking lot. "Arthur?" I asked, looking at him sideways. "Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired, Vivian," he said, his voice unusually quiet, almost flat. "Long night." We drove in silence. The fog was so thick I could barely see the yellow lines on the road. As we turned onto my state route, heading toward the valley where my house sat, the silence inside the van felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Usually, Arthur would slow down as we approached the bend before my driveway, signaling early to warn any drivers behind us in the fog. But today, he didn't slow down. We passed the old rusted tractor that marked my property line. We passed the row of white pines Ray and I had planted. "Arthur," I said, my voice rising in panic as I pointed out the window. "Arthur, you missed my turn. My house is right there." He didn't hit the brakes. Instead, his foot seemed to press harder on the gas pedal, the engine of the van whining as we sped past my gravel driveway. I could see my house in the rearview mirror, a small dark shape swallowed by the gray fog. And then I saw something else. There was a dark SUV parked behind my garage, completely hidden from the main road. "Arthur, stop the car!" I cried out, reaching for the door handle. "What are you doing?" Suddenly, Arthur reached over with his right hand, his grip surprisingly firm as he caught my wrist, keeping me from pulling the latch. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his face pale and set like stone. "Don't look back, Vivian," he whispered, his voice trembling with a raw, genuine fear that froze the blood in my veins. "And don't go back home. Your neighbor is watching you. Tomorrow, you'll understand." My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped sparrow as Arthur navigated the winding, fog-choked bends of State Route 7. He didn't slow down until we reached the gravel parking lot of the Blue Star Diner, a low-slung brick building where the truckers parked their rigs to sleep off the night shifts. The neon sign buzzed in the gray morning light, casting a sickly pink glow over the hood of the transit van. Arthur cut the engine. The sudden silence inside the vehicle was deafening, save for the rhythmic clicking of the cooling manifold. He finally turned his head to look at me, his eyes clouded with a deep, weary sorrow that made him look 10 years older than his 67 years. "I'm sorry I scared you, Vivian," he said, his voice barely louder than a whisper. He reached over and picked up the blue enamel mug I had given him, holding it between his calloused hands as if seeking warmth from a fire that had already gone out. "But I couldn't let you walk into that house today, not after what I saw, not after what I heard." I clutched my canvas work bag to my chest like a shield. "Arthur, please, tell me what's happening. Who was in my driveway? Why was there an SUV behind my garage?" Arthur took a slow, deliberate breath, his gaze drifting out toward the fog rolling off the Ohio River. "Yesterday afternoon, I was down at the hardware store in town getting some weather stripping. Your brother-in-law, Silas, was there. He was talking to a man in a dark wool coat, some high-priced lawyer from Columbus, judging by the license plate on his car. They didn't see me behind the shelving in the plumbing aisle. Silas was showing him a copy of your property deed, Vivian. He told the lawyer that you were mentally unstable since Ray passed, that you were working yourself to death at the hospital and neglecting the property. He said the house was an environmental hazard and that he was going to file for an emergency conservatorship to seize the estate before the end of the month. The air left my lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. Conservatorship. The word felt cold, heavy, and terrifyingly clinical. "That's not all," Arthur continued, his grip tightening on the mug. "This morning, I got to your road early. I always park down by the old bridge to check my tire pressure before I pick you up. I saw that dark SUV pull up your driveway. Silas got out, and he had a key, Vivian. He let himself right into your back door. Another man, a surveyor, I reckon, because he had a tripod and a transit level, started walking your lower ridge, driving red wooden stakes into the ground. They are planning to post a notice on your door today. Silas has a sheriff's deputy friend who is going to serve you with papers claiming the home is unsafe for occupancy due to a severe structural hazard on the creek bank." I sat there, the blood rushing in my ears like the sound of the river during the spring thaw. If you have ever been targeted by people who look at your grief and see an opportunity, you know the exact moment the world tilts on its axis. You realize that the rules you've lived by your whole life, honesty, hard work, decency, don't mean a thing to people who view your life as a line item on a balance sheet. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, hot and stinging against my cold skin. I wasn't crying because I was weak. I was crying because the sheer malice of it was so heavy, it pressed the breath right out of me. "Where do I go, Arthur?" I whispered, looking down at my hands. "I can't go home. If they serve me those papers, if they declare the house unsafe, I won't even be allowed inside to get my things." "You're coming to my sister's place in the next county," Arthur said firmly, starting the engine once more. "And then, Vivian, you're going to do what you do best. You're going to look at the numbers. Because men like Silas always leave a paper trail, and they always assume a woman like you doesn't know how to read it." Arthur was right. I am a medical billing clerk. I spend 8 hours a night dissecting the complex predatory language of insurance claims, hospital liens, and financial liability. If there was a loophole, Silas had undoubtedly used the system to create it. And if he used the system, there would be a record. An hour later, I was sitting at the laminate dining table in Nicole's small second-floor apartment. Nicole had rushed home from the dental clinic the moment I called her, her scrub still smelling of mint antiseptic. When I told her what Arthur had seen, she didn't just cry. She paced the floor, her knuckles white as she clenched her fists. "He's a monster, Aunt Viv," Nicole cried, her voice cracking with indignation. "He's been planning this since the day Uncle Ray's heart stopped. He thinks because you're 60 and tired, you'll just fold. He thinks you'll take whatever small pittance of a settlement his development company offers you and slide quietly into some state-funded senior home." "I am not sliding anywhere, Nicole," I said, my voice steadying as the initial shock began to crystallize into a cold, hard anger. "But we need to understand how he did this. He couldn't just fabricate a structural hazard, and he certainly couldn't get a conservatorship without a financial hook. We need the paperwork. If you are fighting a battle against family greed, let me tell you this. Do not raise your voice. Do not make scenes. Gather your receipts." Nicole and I spent the next 6 hours in the basement of the Jefferson County Administration Building. The air down there smelled of damp concrete, old dust, and the slow decay of public records. The clerk behind the counter was a woman named Myra, a high school classmate of my late husband. When she saw the determination in my eyes, she didn't ask questions. She simply wheeled out 3 heavy gray metal cart boxes containing the recent land transfers, lien filings, and probate claims for our district. My fingers, worn from decades of typing billing codes, turned the heavy paper pages of the county ledger. And there, buried beneath a stack of standard utility easements, I found the knife Silas had driven into my back. It was a document titled Notice of Assignment of Debt and Intent to Foreclose. When Ray was in the ICU during his final weeks, the hospital had generated a bill of $142,000 that our expired insurance refused to cover. I had been paying $50 a month, every single penny I could squeeze from my meager savings, to keep the account in good standing under a hardship agreement. But 3 weeks ago, the hospital's billing department had sold a block of delinquent accounts to a private debt buyer. The name of the debt buyer was Monongahela Holdings, LLC. Using the public terminal in the corner of the records room, my heart pounding in my throat, I paid the $5 fee to look up the corporate registration for Monongahela Holdings, LLC. My eyes scanned the digital document, past the registered agent's name, down to the list of managing members. There it was, written in clean digital font, Clara Vance, Silas's wife. Silas hadn't just waited for the bank to come knocking. He had actively gone to the hospital's debt collection agency, purchased my late husband's medical debt for pennies on the dollar through his wife's shell company, and was now acting as my primary creditor. Because I was paying the hospital directly, and they had sold the debt without notifying me in writing, a blatant violation of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, Silas had immediately declared the entire $142,000 balance in default. He had filed a junior lien against my property, using my default as the legal basis to claim I was financially incompetent to manage my estate. "He bought Uncle Ray's dying days," Nicole whispered, her hand covering her mouth as she stared at the screen over my shoulder. Her eyes were wide with horror. "He bought his pain to use as a crowbar to pry you out of your home." "Yes, he did," I said. My voice was very quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes when the last trace of fear is replaced by an absolute, unyielding certainty. I looked down at my hands, resting on the cold formica table of the county records room. I thought of Ray. I thought of the grease under his fingernails, the way he would come home from the mill smelling of iron and sweat, and how he had spent his entire life working to ensure I would always have a roof over my head. Silas thought he was playing a game of chess with a tired old widow. He thought my age made me weak and my grief made me blind. But he had forgotten one crucial thing. I spent my nights finding the mistakes that hospital administrators made. I knew how to read the codes. I knew how the billing systems worked, and more importantly, I knew the laws governing how debt must be transferred and validated. "Nicole," I said, reaching into my bag for my yellow legal pad and my favorite fine-point black pen. "Get your coat. We have a lot of phone calls to make, and we need to print every single billing ledger from the hospital database before my shift starts tonight." "What are we going to do, Aunt Viv?" Nicole asked, a spark of hope finally cutting through her tears. I looked at the corporate filing for Monongahela Holdings, LLC, memorizing the registration number. We are going to let Silas think he has won. We are going to let him serve his papers. And then we are going to show him exactly what happens when you try to audit a woman who has spent 30 years keeping the books. As we walked out of the county building, the cold Ohio wind whipped my face, but I didn't feel the chill anymore. I didn't stay hidden at Nicole's apartment for long. To catch a thief, you have to let them believe they've already succeeded. You have to let them get comfortable in their own lies. The very next afternoon, I had Arthur drop me off at the end of my gravel driveway. The heavy river fog had burned off, replaced by a cold, blinding Ohio sunlight that made the frost on my dying tomato vines look like shattered glass. As I walked up the porch steps, my eyes caught the bright red plastic surveyor's ribbons fluttering on the wooden stakes driven into the slope down by the creek. They looked like little flags of surrender. My heart squeezed with a bitter, heavy ache, but I kept my face completely blank. If you've ever had to smile at a wolf while you're quietly measuring him for a coat, you know the kind of courage it takes. You don't scream. You don't throw fits. You just breathe in the cold air, open your front door, and wait for them to make their move. I didn't have to wait long. At exactly 3 o'clock, the gravel in my driveway crunched under the tires of a heavy vehicle. I stood by my kitchen window, a damp dish towel in my hands, and watched as a white county sheriff's cruiser pulled in, followed closely by Silas's shiny black SUV. Out of the cruiser stepped Deputy Miller, a man whose face I knew from the local diner, though he wouldn't look me in the eye today. Behind him came Silas, wearing his heavy wool coat and the expression of profound, theatrical sadness. He looked like a man attending a funeral he had paid for himself. When I opened the door, the cold wind rushed into my small living room, carrying the scent of Silas's cherry blend pipe tobacco from where he stood on the porch. "Vivian," Silas said, his voice dropping into that greasy, rehearsed register of sympathy. "I'm so sorry it's come to this. I really am. But we have to face reality." The county inspector looked at the creek bank. "The erosion under your foundation is a disaster waiting to happen. The house is legally uninhabitable, Viv." Deputy Miller stepped forward, looking down at his boots as he handed me a thick manila envelope. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance. I'm just serving the emergency petition. It's a temporary environmental vacate order, combined with a petition for emergency financial management. There's a hearing scheduled for Tuesday morning at the county courthouse." I let my hands tremble as I took the envelope. I didn't have to fake the shaking entirely. The sheer audacity of what they were doing made my blood run cold. I looked past Silas's shoulder toward the hill where his massive brick house sat, looking down on my modest home like a predator waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. "An emergency vacate order, Silas?" I asked, my voice small, thin, and fragile. "Where am I supposed to go? Ray and I built this place. We paid off the mortgage 5 years ago." "You'll stay at the motel in town for now, Vivian," Silas said, reaching out to pat my shoulder. I had to summon every ounce of my mother's Appalachian upbringing not to flinch away from his touch. "My development company will cover the first week. We'll handle the bank and the medical debts. We'll get you set up in a nice, clean senior apartment over in Steubenville. No stairs, no maintenance. It's the safest thing for you. You're not managing well since Ray passed. The hospital shift is eating away at your mind." "I see," I whispered, holding the envelope against my chest like it was a shield. "Tuesday morning, you said?" 10 o'clock, courtroom 3, Deputy Miller said softly, clearly uncomfortable with his role in Silas's theater. "You have the right to legal counsel, Mrs. Vance." "She doesn't need to waste money on lawyers, Miller," Silas interrupted quickly, giving me a tight, patronizing smile. "We're family. We're going to resolve this together, quietly. I'm just taking the burden off your shoulders, Vivian. Ray would have wanted me to look after you." I looked Silas dead in the eye. He thought he saw a broken, 60-year-old widow ready to sign away her life's work just to make the pressure stop. He didn't see the woman who had spent 30 years finding the missing pennies in multi-million-dollar hospital ledgers. "Thank you, Silas," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I suppose I'll see you on Tuesday." I closed the door slowly, waiting until I heard their vehicles pull down the driveway before I let out the breath I'd been holding. That night, I went to work. I didn't call out sick. I didn't take a personal day. When Arthur picked me up at 10:15 p.m., he looked at me through the rearview mirror, his silver eyebrows knitted together in silent concern. I handed him his blue enamel mug, the steam from the chamomile tea rising between us like a quiet promise of stability. "You all right, Vivian?" he asked as he put the van in gear. "I am, Arthur," I said, looking out at the dark, winding Ohio roads. "They served the papers today. The hearing is Tuesday." Arthur nodded slowly, taking a sip of his tea. "The fox thinks he's got the hen cornered in the coop. He doesn't know you've already unlocked the back gate." "He has no idea," I agreed quietly. When I walked into the hospital's billing office that night, the fluorescent lights didn't feel cold anymore. They felt like spotlights on a stage where I was about to perform. The office was empty, save for the rhythmic clicking of my keyboard and the hum of the mainframe. I sat down at my desk, pulled out my yellow legal pad, and went to work on the hospital's internal database. Because I had been a senior billing specialist for 15 years, I had administrative access to the legacy archiving system, the database where old, closed, or transferred accounts were stored before they were purged from the active servers. I typed in Ray's social security number, my fingers flying across the keys with a speed born of absolute focus. The screen flickered, and then the ledger appeared. Patient, Raymond Vance. Total charges, 142,450 hours. I began to dissect the line items, tracing the digital life of the debt. I looked for the transfer logs, the exact moment the hospital had bundled Ray's account and sold it to Monongahela Holdings, LLC. As I scrolled through the system notes, I found the first major discrepancy. 4 months ago, the hospital had applied for and received a federal reimbursement grant under the Medicare Bad Debt Program, which covered 65% of Ray's outstanding ICU charges because we fell below the local median income bracket. The hospital's system had automatically applied a charity write-off adjustment of $92,592.50 to the account. That meant the actual, legally collectible balance remaining on Ray's account was not $142,250. It was exactly $49,157.50. But when the hospital's third-party billing contractor had exported the batch of delinquent accounts to sell to private debt buyers, they had exported the gross unadjusted file, the raw inflated figure before the federal write-off was applied. Clara and Silas's shell company, Monongahela Holdings, had purchased a defaulted debt of $142,450 for a measly $5,000. But legally, that $142,000 debt did not exist anymore. By trying to collect on the full, unadjusted amount, and by filing a property lien based on that fraudulent figure, Monongahela Holdings was committing a massive, triple-count violation of both federal banking laws and the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. But it got worse for Silas. Much worse. I clicked on the digital signature of the hospital administrator who had authorized the sale of the unadjusted debt bundle to Monongahela Holdings. The name on the digital authorization form was Marcus Vance. Marcus was Silas's eldest son, my nephew, who worked as an assistant director in the hospital's procurement department. He had no legal authority over patient billing accounts. He had used his internal security credentials to bypass the billing department's protocols, exporting the raw, unadjusted debt files directly to his mother's shell company so his father could use them as a financial weapon against me. It was self-dealing. It was corporate fraud. It was a conspiracy to commit equity skimming on a family home, utilizing protected medical billing data in direct violation of HIPAA regulations. My hands were steady as I printed out every single document. I printed the original ledger, the Medicare Bad Debt Reimbursement Authorization, the internal transfer logs showing Marcus's unauthorized digital signature, and the corporate registration for Monongahela Holdings, LLC. Each sheet of paper slid out of the office printer with a quiet, satisfying hiss. To anyone else, these were just sheets of white paper covered in tiny black numbers and dry legal codes. But to me, they were the bars of the cage Silas had built for himself. By 5:00 a.m., my yellow legal pad was covered in notes. I had organized the documents into a neat chronological binder. If you are fighting for your life, you don't use a dull knife. You make sure your blade is so sharp that your opponent doesn't even feel the cut until they try to move. Silas thought he was dealing with a tired old widow who didn't know the difference between a lien and a mortgage. He had no idea that I had spent my entire adult life navigating the very system he was trying to abuse. When the sun finally began to rise over the Ohio River, casting a pale pink light through the office windows, I packed my binder into my canvas bag. I felt a profound, quiet peace settle over me. The fear was gone. The exhaustion was gone. As I walked out of the hospital lobby into the crisp morning air, Arthur's white transit van was already waiting at the curb. I climbed into the passenger seat and handed him his blue enamel mug. "You look different today, Vivian," Arthur said, looking at me with a soft, knowing smile as he took the warm mug. "You look like a woman who has found her path." "I have, Arthur," I said, leaning my head back against the seat as the heater began to warm the cabin. "I have the numbers. On Tuesday morning, we're going to show Silas exactly how much my husband's life was worth to him." Arthur put the van in gear, the tires rolling smoothly over the asphalt as we headed toward the county courthouse. Tuesday morning arrived with a biting gray frost that clung to the limestone steps of the Jefferson County Courthouse. The building was a heavy 19th century monument to civic order, smelling of pine-scented floor wax, damp wool coats, and the stale anxiety of decades of human trouble. I walked up those steps with Nicole on my left and Arthur on my right. I wasn't wearing a designer suit. I wore my best navy blue church dress, a wool coat I'd bought on clearance at JCPenney 5 years ago, and a pair of sensible black loafers. Under my arm, I clutched a cheap black vinyl binder, the plastic rings slightly warped from the thick stack of papers nestled inside. If you have ever had to stand in a room built of polished marble and dark oak, facing people who have all the money, all the connections, and all the arrogance in the world, you know the cold weight that sits in the pit of your stomach. You feel like a trespasser in a world designed to make you feel small. But as I took a deep breath of that drafty courthouse air, I looked down at my hands. They were the hands of a woman who had worked for 30 years, hands that had held my dying husband's fingers, hands that knew how to type the codes that kept the financial machinery of a hospital running. I wasn't small, and I wasn't afraid anymore. Courtroom 3 was located at the end of a long, high-ceilinged corridor. When we entered, Silas and Clara were already sitting at the mahogany table on the right side of the aisle. Silas was wearing a tailored gray suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, his silver hair combed back perfectly. Clara sat beside him, wrapped in a plush camel hair coat, her fingers adorned with diamond rings that caught the harsh fluorescent light. They were whispering to a tall, sharp-featured man in a dark blue suit, Bradley Sterling, the high-priced attorney Silas had brought in from Columbus. When Silas saw me walk in with Nicole and Arthur, his face shifted into that familiar, greasy mask of sorrowful concern. He actually sighed, shaking his head slightly as if to say, "Look at this poor, confused woman." "Vivian," Silas murmured as I approached the opposite table. He stood up, reaching out a hand. "I'm glad you made it. We can still settle this quietly before the judge comes out. There's no need to make a public spectacle of Ray's estate. We've got a lovely room reserved for you at the Carriage House Senior Living Community. We can have your things moved by Friday." I didn't take his hand. I didn't even look at it. I simply pulled out my chair, sat down, and placed my black vinyl binder flat on the table. "I'll take my chances with the law, Silas," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and entirely devoid of the trembling he was expecting. Clara let out a soft, dry laugh, adjusting her pearl necklace. "Stubborn to the end, Vivian. Just like Ray. But stubbornness won't fix a crumbling foundation, and it certainly won't pay off $140,000 of medical debt. You're living in a fantasy world." Before I could reply, the heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open, and the bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Evelyn Thornton." We stood as Judge Thornton ascended the bench. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, observant gray eyes and a halo of short, iron gray curls. She adjusted her glasses, looked down at the documents in front of her, and sighed. The docket was full today, and she looked like a woman who had no patience for wasted time. "We are here today on case number 24 CV889, Judge Thornton began, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "An emergency petition for a temporary environmental vacate order and a petition for temporary financial conservatorship over the estate of Vivian Vance, filed by petitioner Silas Vance. Mr. Sterling, you represent the petitioner. Please state your case. Sterling stood up, smoothing his tie with a practiced, arrogant grace. Thank you, Your Honor. My client, Silas Vance, is the brother-in-law of the respondent, Vivian Vance. Since the tragic passing of her husband, Raymond, 6 months ago, Mrs. Vance has exhibited signs of severe emotional distress and cognitive decline. She has taken an exhausting night shift position, neglecting both her health and her property, as evidenced by the county building inspector's preliminary assessment attached to our petition. The retaining wall on the creek bank of her property has suffered catastrophic failure, rendering the home a structural hazard. Furthermore, Mrs. Vance is facing massive, unmanageable debt, including a delinquent medical lien of over $142,000 held by Monongahela Holdings, LLC. My client is simply seeking to step in as conservator to protect his sister-in-law, liquidate the unstable asset to satisfy her creditors, and place her in a safe, managed care facility. Silas nodded solemnly, dabbing at his eye with a linen handkerchief as if he were holding back tears of pure grief. Judge Thornton looked over her glasses at me. Mrs. Vance, you are appearing without counsel today. Do you understand the gravity of these petitions? The court takes matters of conservatorship and emergency vacate orders very seriously. I do understand, Your Honor, I said, standing up. My voice was clear. It didn't shake. I looked directly at the judge, ignoring the smug smile that flitted across Clara's face. And with your permission, I would like to present my response. Go ahead, Mrs. Vance, Judge Thornton said, leaning forward. I opened my black vinyl binder, the plastic pages crackling in the quiet courtroom. Your Honor, the petitioner's case is built on 3 pillars: a structural hazard, a financial incapacity, and a medical debt. I would like to address each of these pillars with the court's permission, starting with the alleged structural hazard. I pulled out the first document from my binder. Over the weekend, I hired an independent licensed civil engineer from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, Mr. David Kessel. I have his certified report here, along with a stamped survey. Mr. Kessel found that the retaining wall on my creek bank is structurally sound. The red survey stakes driven into my lower ridge last week were placed by an unlicensed surveyor hired directly by Silas's development firm, who misrepresented the property lines to create the illusion of a landslide hazard. Mr. Kessel's report concludes there is 0 risk to the foundation of my home. I handed the document to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. Judge Thornton's eyebrows arched as she scanned the certified blue-stamped document. Sterling quickly stood up. Your Honor, this is a last-minute filing. Overruled, Mr. Sterling, Judge Thornton snapped, her eyes fixed on the paper. I am perfectly capable of reading a certified engineering report. Please continue, Mrs. Vance. Thank you, Your Honor, I said, turning the page of my binder. Now to address the second pillar, my alleged financial incapacity. The petitioner claims I am unable to manage my affairs. I have submitted my employment records from Jefferson County Hospital, where I have worked as a senior medical billing clerk for 15 years. I have also submitted my personal banking ledgers for the past 12 months. Despite my grief, my bills have been paid on time, and my home mortgage is fully satisfied. The only outstanding debt against my name is the medical bill from my late husband's final weeks in the ICU. I paused, looking over at Silas. His smug expression had begun to falter, a tiny muscle twitching at the corner of his jaw. Clara was sitting up straighter, her hand tightening around her designer purse. Now, let us look at that debt, I said, my voice dropping into a measured, dangerous calm. The petitioner claims I owe $142,450 to a private debt buyer called Monongahela Holdings, LLC, which filed a junior lien against my property. I have the corporate registration for Monongahela Holdings here, Your Honor. The sole managing member of this LLC is Clara Vance, the petitioner's wife. A quiet murmur rippled through the gallery. Nicole squeezed Arthur's arm, her eyes shining with triumph. But the debt itself is a fraud, I continued, pulling out the hospital's internal ledger. I spent my night shifts retrieving the original archiving files from my husband's account. Because Raymond and I fell below the local median income bracket, the hospital applied for and received a federal Medicare bad debt reimbursement grant. 65% of Ray's bill was legally written off under charity care adjustments. The actual, legally collectible balance remaining on the account was exactly $49,857.50. I tapped the next page in my binder. However, when the hospital's third-party contractor exported the delinquent files to sell to private collectors, they exported the raw, unadjusted gross figure of $142,000. Monongahela Holdings purchased this unadjusted debt for $5,000. By attempting to collect on a debt that had already been partially satisfied by federal funds, and by filing a property lien based on that fraudulent figure, Monongahela Holdings is in direct violation of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act and federal banking regulations. Judge Thornton was staring at me now, her pen hovering over her notepad, her expression utterly transfixed. "But it goes deeper, Your Honor," I said, looking directly at Silas, who had gone completely pale, the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. A private debt buyer cannot simply access secure hospital databases to purchase specific individual patient accounts. That is a violation of HIPAA privacy laws. I pulled the internal digital transfer logs from the hospital's database. The unauthorized transfer of my husband's billing file to Monongahela Holdings was digitally signed and approved by Marcus Vance, the Assistant Director of Procurement at the hospital and the son of Silas and Clara Vance. The courtroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Marcus Vance utilized his internal security credentials to bypass billing protocols, exporting my husband's private medical and financial data directly to his mother's shell company, I said, my voice echoing off the high walls. This was a coordinated, fraudulent conspiracy to manufacture a financial crisis, utilize a false debt to file an illegal lien, and use the threat of a fabricated environmental hazard to seize my home for their own commercial development project. I closed the black vinyl binder with a quiet, decisive thud. I have provided the court with the certified engineering reports, the original hospital ledger showing the federal write-offs, the digital audit logs showing Marcus Vance's unauthorized signatures, and the corporate filings linking Monongahela Holdings directly to Silas and Clara Vance. I ask that the emergency petition for vacate and the petition for conservatorship be dismissed with prejudice, and that the illegal lien against my home be vacated immediately. I sat down. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the courtroom was the hum of the heating vents. Silas looked as if he were about to faint, his face a pasty, sickly green. Clara was staring down at the table, her hands shaking so violently her diamond rings clattered against the wood. Sterling, their high-priced Columbus attorney, slowly sat back down in his chair, his briefcase remaining closed, his mouth slightly open. He knew when a case was not just lost, but utterly annihilated. Judge Thornton took off her glasses. She looked at the documents I had submitted, then looked down at Silas and Clara with a cold, terrifying fury. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Thornton said, her voice dripping with ice, "do you have any response to the evidence presented by Mrs. Vance?" Sterling cleared his throat, his voice cracking. "Your Honor, my clients. We would like to request a temporary recess to—" "Request denied," Judge Thornton barked, slamming her gavel down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. "The evidence presented by Mrs. Vance is clear, meticulous, and deeply disturbing. This court will not be used as a weapon of financial predation and family greed. The emergency petition for a vacate order is dismissed. The petition for conservatorship is dismissed. The lien filed by Monongahela Holdings, LLC, against the property of Vivian Vance is hereby declared null, void, and vacated." She leaned forward, her sharp eyes locking onto Silas. "Furthermore, this court is referring the digital audit logs and the corporate filings of Monongahela Holdings, LLC, to the Office of the Ohio Attorney General and the hospital's Corporate Compliance Board for immediate investigation into Medicare fraud, HIPAA violations, and grand larceny. This court is adjourned." The gavel struck one final time, and the judge swept out of the room. I sat there at the table, my hand resting on the cool plastic of my binder. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, but this time it wasn't a tear of grief or fear. It was the feeling of a heavy, suffocating weight finally being lifted off my chest. I looked up, and Nicole was already throwing her arms around my neck, sobbing with joy, while Arthur stood behind her, a quiet, proud smile on his face, his silver mustache twitching as he nodded in silent approval. Across the aisle, Silas and Clara sat frozen in their chairs, staring at the ruins of their greed. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 3 swung shut behind us, the solid click of the latch sounding like the final exclamation point on a long, painful sentence. As we walked out into the high-ceilinged marble corridor of the Jefferson County Courthouse, the silence was broken only by the sharp, hurried squeak of Bradley Sterling's leather shoes as he practically dragged Silas and Clara toward the elevators. Silas didn't look back. His shoulders were hunched, his expensive gray wool coat suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for him. Clara was clutching his arm, her head bowed, her face completely hidden by the collar of her camel hair coat. They looked like 2 people who had gone out to hunt a rabbit and ended up stepping squarely into a bear trap of their own making. I stopped at the top of the limestone steps outside, pulling my worn wool coat tight against the biting Ohio wind. The air smelled of winter, cold, clean, and heavy with the promise of snow. I took a deep, shaky breath, the freezing air burning my lungs in the most wonderful way. "You did it, Aunt Viv," Nicole whispered, her voice cracking with emotion as she threw her arms around my neck. She was crying, her hot tears soaking into the shoulder of my coat. "You actually did it. You saved the house." "No, Nicole," I said softly, squeezing her tight as I looked over her shoulder at Arthur, who was standing a few feet away with his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, a quiet, steady warmth shining in his eyes. "We saved it. We did it together." If you have ever stood on the steps of a building that represents all the authority in the world, knowing you just fought the people who tried to make you feel small and you came out standing, then you know the specific, quiet triumph that settled into my bones that morning. It wasn't a loud, boasting kind of victory. It was the feeling of your feet finally touching solid ground after months of treading water in a dark, stormy sea. The fallout from that Tuesday morning was swift and merciless, the way justice is when the paperwork is too clear to deny. Within 48 hours, the hospital's corporate compliance board went into a state of absolute panic. To avoid a devastating federal lawsuit and a public relations nightmare that would have ruined the facility's reputation in the valley, they acted with cold, clinical efficiency. Marcus, Silas's son, was terminated from his position in the procurement department before the week was out. He didn't just lose his job. The hospital administration referred his unauthorized access of my husband's medical files to the state licensing board. He eventually took a plea deal with the county prosecutor, receiving 2 years of probation and the permanent loss of his administrative credentials. As for Monongahela Holdings LLC, the state attorney general's office didn't let them off easy. Clara's shell company was dissolved by court order, and they were hit with a $75,000 civil penalty for systemic violations of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. The illegal lien against my home was officially marked as satisfied and discharged in the county registry, the digital ink clearing my name and my property once and for all. But the hospital board did one more thing. To ensure I wouldn't seek legal damages for the security breach, the chief executive officer himself called me into his wood-paneled office. He didn't offer me a payout, and I didn't ask for one. Instead, he offered me a promotion. I was transferred from the grueling 11 p.m. night shift to a daytime supervisory role in the billing compliance department, complete with a salary increase and a restored medical benefit package. For the first time in 6 months, I didn't have to sleep through the beautiful, pale winter afternoons. I didn't have to stare at glowing computer screens while the rest of the world was dreaming. A few weeks later, in the middle of December, the first real snow of the season came down, wrapping our small valley in a thick, quiet blanket of white. I stood at my kitchen window, looking down at the creek bank. The red surveyor stakes were gone. I had pulled them out of the frozen ground myself, throwing them into the kindling pile behind the garage. The white pines Ray and I had planted stood tall and green against the snow, their branches heavy with the fresh, clean powder. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon, pine cleaner, and hot yeast rolls baking in the oven. The ghostly, intrusive scent of cherry pipe tobacco was completely gone, replaced by the warm, simple sensory details of a home that was fully mine again. I sat down at my worn laminate kitchen table, running my fingers over the tiny scratches in the formica where Ray and I had shared 34 years of morning coffee. If you are sitting at your own kitchen table right now, holding a cold cup of tea and wondering if you have the strength to stand up to the people who are trying to push you into a corner, I want you to listen to me. Stay with me. Strength doesn't look like a raised fist or a loud voice. Sometimes, strength is just a quiet woman with a yellow legal pad, a fine point pen, and the patience to let greedy people trip over their own shoelaces. You don't have to match their noise. You just have to gather your receipts, hold on to your dignity, and trust that the truth has a weight of its own. The tea kettle on the stove began to whistle, its cheerful, rising steam filling the kitchen. I stood up, taking 2 mugs from the cupboard. Mine was the chipped green plastic tumbler, but the other was the blue enamel mug with the tiny chip on the rim. Just as I poured the boiling water over the chamomile tea leaves and added a generous spoonful of wild clover honey, I heard the familiar, comforting sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. It wasn't the county transit van anymore. Arthur had retired fully from the ride-share program at the end of November, his 67-year-old joints finally getting the rest they deserved. But every Tuesday morning, like clockwork, his old blue pickup truck would pull up my driveway. I opened the back door before he even reached the porch steps, the cold winter air rushing in to meet the warmth of the kitchen. Arthur was wearing his heavy flannel jacket, his silver mustache dusted with tiny flakes of snow. He looked at me, a soft, knowing smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Morning, Vivian," he said, wiping his boots carefully on the mat. "Morning, Arthur," I replied, stepping aside to let him into the warm house. "The tea is just stepping, and the rolls are almost out of the oven." "Much obliged," he said, taking his coat off and hanging it on the peg by the door. We sat down at the table, the blue enamel mug steaming between us. There was no tension in the silence now. It was the quiet of 2 people who had survived the winter and were looking forward to the spring. As we drank our tea, my eyes drifted to the window, looking up the snowy hill toward Silas's sprawling brick house. A large wooden for sale sign was driven deep into the frozen front lawn near his driveway. With the collapse of his commercial development project and the heavy fines from the state, Silas and Clara had been forced to put the property on the market to satisfy their own creditors. Just last week, Silas had walked down that hill. He didn't come to my porch. He just stood at the property line, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of an old work jacket, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. I had gone out to the porch, and we had stood there 10 yards apart, looking at each other through the falling snow. He didn't apologize. Men like Silas rarely do, but he had looked at the white pines, then looked at me and muttered something about how times were hard for everyone. I didn't yell at him. I didn't tell him he got what he deserved. I had simply walked to the garage, retrieved a small wooden box of Ray's old machinist tools, the ones with the brass calipers his father had given him, and set them on the fence post between our properties. "We aren't family anymore, Silas," I had told him, my voice level and quiet, setting a boundary that was as solid as the limestone foundation of my home. "The trust is gone, and you can't build a bridge out of broken promises, but I don't wish you ruin. Take the tools. Ray would have wanted you to have them." He had taken the box and walked back up the hill, his boots leaving deep, lonely tracks in the white drifts. It wasn't a perfect, cinematic reconciliation, but it was enough. I had kept my peace, and I had kept my home. "The wind is picking up," Arthur said softly, his voice bringing me back to the warm kitchen. He took a slow, appreciative sip of his chamomile tea. "Looks like we're in for another couple of inches before nightfall." "Let it snow, Arthur," I said, leaning back in my chair, looking at the steam rising from my green tumbler. "We've got plenty of wood, the pantry is full, and the roof is sturdy." We sat there in the quiet warmth of the kitchen, 2 older people who had worked hard, lived honest lives, and found a way to keep the cold drafts out. Because when you finally strip away the greed, the assets, and the balance sheets of the world, you realize the simplest truth of all. Love is a gift, not a line item in a budget. And my Ray's love was still protecting this house, woven deep into the very wood and stone of the place we had built together.